40 days in enemy country, and now they are back. 12 men walk into the camp at Kadesh Barnea, carrying a single cluster of grapes. So heavy it has to be slung on a pole between two of them. A nation of former slaves waits in the heat, watching them come. These people have been promised this land. They want to know what is sitting on it. 10 of the 12 give their report. Somewhere in the middle of it, they use a word, Nephilim. They say it the way you say a word everybody already knows. No explanation, no definition, no pause for the crowd to catch up. And here is the detail that should stop you. Nobody asks. Moses does not interrupt. The elders do not request clarification. 2 million terrified people hear a term that modern scholars still cannot confidently translate, and every one of them apparently understands it instantly. Then the camp breaks. Numbers 13 verse 33 records the line that finishes them. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and so we seemed to them. That sentence buys Israel 40 years in the wilderness and a generation of graves in the sand. One word did that. So let me put the argument of this whole episode on the table right at the start, because I want you holding it the entire way through. The fight about the Nephilim has never really been a fight about giants. It has been a fight about whether the wall between heaven and earth can be crossed. And every generation has answered that question according to what it could afford to believe. Hold on to that. We will come back and stand on it at the end. Now go back to where the word first appears and read it slowly, because almost nobody does. Genesis gives this subject 4 verses. 4. Sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and took wives from among them, any they chose. God sets a limit of 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. The passage ends there. After that, the story moves on to violence filling the earth, and God grieving that he made anything at all, and a man building a boat. Look at what the text refuses to do. It never says the sons of God were angels. It never says the Nephilim were tall. No line blames them for the flood. Their fate goes unmentioned. And beyond the general verdict of wickedness that follows, the passage refuses to tell you how to judge any of it. 4 verses, and every single one of them withholds the thing you most want to know. That reticence is not an accident. Ancient writers were perfectly capable of describing monsters when they wanted to. Whoever assembled Genesis into its final form had a story here, and chose to compress it into a shape that raises questions instead of answering them. 2,500 years later, we are still asking. Start with the word, because the word is where the trouble begins. Nephilim. In Hebrew, the consonants are nun, pei, lamed, and most Hebrew students will tell you those are the letters of the verb naphal, which means to fall. Fallen ones. The answer is satisfying. It fits the imagery. The reading has fed 1,000 sermons and roughly 9,000 videos. Yet it is far less certain than you have been told. The great Brown, Driver and Briggs lexicon, still one of the standard reference works for biblical Hebrew, looked at the proposed derivations and called them all precarious. None of them convincing. Some scholars read the form as passive, ones who have fallen, on the pattern of other Hebrew nouns of that shape. Others read it as causative, those who make others fall, which would make the name a description of violence rather than of origin. Michael Heiser, who spent much of his career on this material, argued the root is not Hebrew at all but Aramaic, from a word meaning giant. I want to be honest with you about the state of the evidence. We do not know. The word appears in only 2 passages in the entire Hebrew Bible, and one of them is quoting frightened men, which brings us to the decision that shaped everything after it. Around the 3rd century before Christ, Jewish translators in Alexandria began rendering their scriptures into Greek. When they reached this verse, they had a choice. They could carry the strange word across untranslated and let Greek readers wonder. Instead, they reached for an existing Greek word, gigantes. Now, in English, that looks like a neutral technical term. It was nothing of the sort. In Greek religion, the gigantes were the earth-born, monstrous sons of Gaia, who made war on the Olympian gods and were destroyed for it. The translators did not simply say, large men. They imported an entire mythology with all its associations of rebellion against heaven and divine retribution attached. That word travelled. The Latin Vulgate took it up as gigantes. From Latin it reached English, and when the King James translators sat down with Genesis, 6 in the early 1600s. They wrote giants in the earth in those days. Modern translations largely reverse the decision. Open most contemporary Bibles and you will find Nephilim printed there untranslated, with a footnote that quietly admits nobody is sure. Sit with what that means. The average English reader's entire experience of this passage has been governed by two translation choices made about 1800 years apart in opposite directions. One generation was handed monsters, another was handed a mystery. Neither was handed the Hebrew. Here is where the history turns strange, and where most treatments of this subject quietly mislead you. If you grew up in almost any Protestant or Catholic church, you were probably taught something like this. The sons of God were the godly line of Seth. The daughters of men were the corrupt line of Cain. The passage is a warning against believers marrying unbelievers. The angel business is a strange fringe idea that crept in from apocryphal books and ancient alien documentaries. That framing has the history precisely backwards. Go to the Second Temple period, the centuries between the last Hebrew prophets and the birth of Jesus, and look at what Jewish readers actually thought this passage meant. Not one of them proposes the line of Seth. The book known as First Enoch, parts of which date to the 3rd century BCE, expands the 4 verses into a full narrative. A group of heavenly beings called Watchers descend, bind themselves by oath, take human wives, and teach humanity metalworking, weaponry, cosmetics, sorcery, and astrology. Their offspring are giants who devour everything and turn on each other. The flood comes as cleanup. Then, in a detail that would echo through Jewish and Christian demonology for centuries, Enoch says, "The disembodied spirits of these dead giants become the evil spirits that afflict the world." The Book of Jubilees, written roughly a century or so before Christ, tells the same story. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, buried in the caves at Qumran and recovered in the late 1940s, sits an Aramaic text scholars call the Book of Giants, which gives the giants names and dreams and terror about their coming judgment. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing for a Roman audience in the 1st century, states it flatly. Many angels of God, he writes, kept company with women and fathered sons who were unjust and contemptuous of everything good. And then he adds a phrase worth noticing. He calls it the tradition. Not his theory, the tradition. Philo of Alexandria, his contemporary, treats the passage in a work titled On the Giants and identifies the sons of God as angels. And some Greek manuscripts of Genesis itself do not say sons of God at that point at all. They say angels of God. The translators made their reading explicit in the text. Now, bring that forward into the Christian centuries and watch what happens. Justin Martyr, born around the year 100 and killed in Rome around 165, reads the passage as angels who fell through desire and whose offspring were demons. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing near the end of the 2nd century against the Gnostics, holds the same view. Tertullian of Carthage, active from the late 2nd into the early 3rd century, builds arguments on it, including a famously grumpy passage about women's ornamentation, which he traces to what the fallen angels taught. Athenagoras uses it in a formal defense of Christianity addressed to a Roman emperor. These are not marginal voices. These are the people constructing the foundations of Christian doctrine, and they are unanimous. So what changed? Sextus Julius Africanus, a Christian chronicler born around the year 160 and dead by roughly 240, wrote a 5-volume world history. Most of it is lost, surviving only in fragments quoted by later writers. In one of those fragments, he offers something new. The descendants of Seth, he suggests, are called the sons of God because righteous men and patriarchs came from that line all the way down to the Savior. The descendants of Cain are simply called the seed of men, having nothing divine in them. Read Africanus carefully and you notice something telling. He does not present this as the obvious meaning. He acknowledges that others take the passage to refer to angels. He is proposing an alternative and he knows it. Then the alternative starts winning. And I want to be careful here, because the reasons are documented, and they are not primarily about better evidence. Consider the pressures piling up on the 3rd and 4th century church. First, mockery from outside. Educated pagan critics like Celsus, and later the Emperor Julian, could point at Christians and say, "You accuse us of believing in gods who seduce mortal women and father heroes, and then you turn around and teach exactly the same thing about your own scriptures." The angelic reading handed opponents a weapon. Second, philosophy. Christian thought in this period was increasingly shaped by Platonic categories in which spirit is immaterial by definition. An angel, with a body capable of fathering children, is not merely shocking. Within that framework, it is a category error. Third, the collapse of Enoch's authority. Enoch had circulated widely and been treated with real respect by some early Christians. As the boundaries of the canon hardened through the 4th century, Enoch was pushed outside them, and the interpretation most closely associated with it lost its supporting scaffolding. Fourth, and I suspect most powerfully, the Church's own developing spirituality. Celibacy was becoming a prestige vocation. The veneration of angels was growing. A doctrine in which angels are driven by sexual desire sat very awkwardly beside a monastic movement holding angels up as the model of purity. John Chrysostom, the great preacher of Antioch and Constantinople, who died in the year 407, hammered the human reading from the pulpit with characteristic force. Augustine of Hippo, who died in 430 as the Vandals besieged his city, then settled the matter for the Latin West in the 15th book of the City of God. There were giants before the flood, he concludes, and the sons of God were the sons of Seth, according to the flesh, who sank into the earthly city when they abandoned righteousness. Augustine also addresses the book of Enoch directly and dismisses its authority. After Augustine, the argument is effectively over in Western Christianity for 1,000 years. Luther held the Sethite view. Calvin held it. Aquinas held it. It became so standard that by the 19th century commentators could describe it as simply what is generally supposed. So here is the first place I will show my hand. I think the Sethite reading won an argument it never actually had. It arrived late, from a writer who admitted he was departing from the common understanding, and it triumphed at precisely the moment when the older reading had become socially and philosophically expensive. That is not the profile of a discovery. That is the profile of a retreat. I am not saying it is wrong. Serious scholars hold it and defend it with real arguments, and I will give you their strongest one shortly. What I am saying is that anyone who tells you the angelic reading is a modern, sensationalist novelty has the timeline inverted, and you should gently decline to be taught by them, because something survived the purge, something that sits inside the Christian canon itself. Jude writes a single furious page attacking teachers who have infiltrated his churches, and to warn his readers, he reaches for 3 examples of catastrophic judgment: Israel in the wilderness, Sodom and Gomorrah, and, between them, angels who did not keep their own position of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, now held in chains under darkness until judgment. Note the 2 verbs, did not keep, abandoned. This is not a description of pride or of rebellion in general. It is spatial. It describes leaving an assigned place. Then Jude does something that has embarrassed commentators ever since. In the very next sentence he says, Sodom and Gomorrah sinned in the same manner as these, giving themselves over to sexual immorality and going after strange flesh. Whatever the angels did, Jude puts it in the same category as the sin of Sodom, and he specifies flesh. A few lines later, Jude quotes a prophecy and attributes it to Enoch, the 7th from Adam. The words he quotes correspond closely to the opening of 1st Enoch. Peter's second letter runs a parallel argument. God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them down, and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness, kept for judgment. Peter then moves immediately to the flood and to Noah. The sequence is the same sequence Genesis gives. The Greek there deserves attention. English Bibles usually render the verb as cast them into hell, but the word Peter uses is built on Tartarus. It appears nowhere else in the Christian scriptures. In Greek religion, Tartarus is the deep prison beneath the underworld, where Zeus confined the defeated Titans. Peter, writing to Greek speakers, chose the word from their mythology. That meant precisely the place where rebel divine beings are imprisoned. Peter's first letter adds the strangest note of all, describing Christ making proclamation to spirits in prison, who were disobedient in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. 3 passages, 3 writers, all pointing at the same moment in Genesis, all describing something that happened to angelic beings, all placed in the days of Noah. The overwhelming scholarly consensus today is that these passages are drawing on the fallen angel reading of Genesis 6 as developed in Jewish tradition. Defenders of the Sethite view offer alternative explanations, and some are ingenious, but the plain sense of those letters is difficult to escape, and I would rather tell you that plainly than pretend the tension is not there. Now, the strongest objection, and it deserves a real answer rather than a dismissal. When the Sadducees try to trap Jesus with a riddle about a woman married to 7 brothers, he answers that in the resurrection people neither marry nor are given in marriage. but are like the angels in heaven. There it is, people say. Angels do not marry. Case closed. Except look at the last two words. In heaven, Jesus is describing the angels who are where they are supposed to be. Jude's entire point is about angels who were not. Whether that distinction is decisive or convenient is a fair question, and honest people land differently on it. But it is a real distinction in the text, not an invention. There is a third reading, and it is the one least discussed on the internet, which is a shame, because it is probably the most historically grounded of the three. Some ancient Jewish translators did not read sons of God as angels or as Sethites. They read it as royalty. The Aramaic version associated with onkelos renders the phrase as sons of nobles. The Greek translator Symmachus rendered it as the sons of the kings. The choice was not arbitrary. Across the ancient Near East, kings were routinely described as sons of gods. Egyptian pharaohs were sons of Re. Mesopotamian kings claimed divine parentage in their inscriptions. A Hittite king was called son of the weather god. The phrase sons of the gods was ordinary royal language in the world. Genesis came out of. Read the passage that way and it becomes a story about power. Divine kings, taking whatever women they wanted, any they chose, and producing a warrior aristocracy that terrorized everyone beneath them. Meredith Kline, a Reformed scholar writing in the 1960s, argued the case at length in an academic journal, and it has quietly persuaded a lot of careful readers since. Notice what this reading does. It takes the language of divine kingship seriously and then demolishes it. These men called themselves sons of gods. The flood proves they were not. Which brings me to the thread I think most treatments of this subject walk straight past. And it is sitting in the last line of the passage. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. The Hebrew behind mighty men is Gibborim, the standard word for warriors, champions, the elite. And the phrase translated men of renown is Anshe Hashem. Literally, men of the name. Greek turns it into the named ones. The Latin renders it viri famosi, which can mean renowned or notorious, and the ambiguity is delicious. Men of the name. Hold that phrase and turn 5 chapters forward. On the plain in Shinar, people gather to build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And they say why. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth. The same word, Shem. Turn 1 more chapter. God speaks to a childless 75-year-old man in Haran and makes him a promise. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great. 3 times in 6 chapters, men who had a name. Men who tried to seize a name, and then a man who is given one. Some scholars, including Heiser, have argued that this repetition is deliberate, and I find it hard to read any other way. The primeval history of Genesis is running a single argument underneath all its strangeness. And the argument is about who gets to be great, and how. The Nephilim episode is not a monster interlude dropped into an otherwise sensible book. It is the opening statement in the Bible's long case against self-made glory. My second position, then, and I will state it without hedging. If your reading of this passage ends at what were they, you have answered a question the text is not asking. Genesis is not interested in their biology. Genesis is interested in their reputation, and in what the world does with men whose reputation exceeds their right. Now let us go back to the camp at Kadesh, because there is a problem there we have not touched. On any reading, the flood is supposed to have ended this. Every living thing outside the boat dies. So how are the spies looking at Nephilim in Canaan, centuries later, in Numbers 13? Genesis itself seems to anticipate the difficulty with a parenthesis that has driven commentators to distraction. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. 4 Hebrew words that solve nothing and open everything. There are 3 main responses, and they are not equally good. The first says the incursion happened twice. Some later Jewish and Christian writers assumed a second descent after the flood. The text nowhere describes one, and I regard this as speculation dressed as exegesis. The second says the flood was regional rather than global, so populations survived elsewhere. That answer works mechanically, but it costs you a great deal in the theology of Genesis, which presents the flood as the unmaking of the whole ordered world. The third answer is the one I find most persuasive, and it has been hiding in plain sight in the Hebrew of Numbers 13 the entire time. Look at what the narrator says about the spy's report. He calls it a dibbar. That noun does not mean a discouraging report or a pessimistic assessment. It means slander, defamation, whispering campaign. The same word covers the malicious talk of gossips. The narrator of Numbers is not neutrally recording a field observation. He is telling you, before you hear a word of it, that what follows is a lie. And the specific claim about the Nephilim sits inside the quotation. Those words came from 10 men. Inside a speech, the text has already labelled as slander, delivered to a crowd they were trying to frighten. Here is my third position, and it is the one I expect most pushback on. I do not think Numbers 13 verse 33 is evidence that Nephilim survived the flood. I think it is evidence that 10 terrified men reached for the most horrifying word in their cultural vocabulary and applied it to people who scared them. They did not say we encountered hybrid beings. They said we felt like insects. None of that is a measurement. What they gave the camp was fear with a name attached, and the text tells you what it thinks of it before you even hear it, which does not mean there were no unusually large people in Canaan. There plainly were, and the Hebrew Bible names their clans with a specificity that reads like ethnography rather than myth. The Anakim around Hebron, with 3 named chieftains, Ahiman, Sheshai and Talmai, the Emim, whom the Moabites named, the Zamzumim, whom the Ammonites named, and behind all of them, the Rephaim. Egyptian execration texts from the Middle Kingdom, ritual curse inscriptions written on pottery and then smashed. List among the enemies of Pharaoh, a group whose name is transcribed as the people of Enoch, with 3 named rulers. Whether these are the biblical Anakim is disputed and unproven. Still, the possibility that Israel's giant clans left a trace in Egyptian bureaucratic records is worth sitting with. So, to the Rephaim, because they carry a secret that reframes this entire subject. In some passages, Rephaim are a people. Genesis places them in Transjordan. Deuteronomy calls Og of Bashan the last of them. Joshua tracks their territory, but open the poetry, and the same consonants mean something else entirely. Isaiah, taunting the king of Babylon, describes the grave stirring itself to meet him, and rousing the Rephaim to greet him. All who are leaders of the earth. Job says the Rephaim tremble beneath the waters. A psalm asks whether the Rephaim rise to praise God. In poetry, the word means the shades of the dead. That overlap is not a coincidence of spelling. In the Ugaritic text recovered from the Syrian coast, describing the religion of Israel's Canaanite neighbors, there is a category of beings called Rapiuma, dead kings and ancestral warriors, honored, invoked, associated with the underworld. A number of specialists caution against merging the 2 senses too quickly, and that caution is fair. But the overlap is there, in 2 languages, across centuries. Think about what that does to the conquest narratives. Israel is not merely being told to take land from tall men. Israel is being told to take land from the territory of the honored, dead, from clans whose very name meant the kings in the grave. And this is where I want to name 2 arguments that should be quietly retired, one from each side. Christians should stop citing Og's bed as proof of a 13-foot giant. Deuteronomy 3 verse 11 says his bed of iron measured 9 cubits by 4, and preachers have been converting that to feet for centuries. Yet the Hebrew word can mean a bier or a sarcophagus, and scholars have argued for a long time that what is being described is a basalt burial container. Coffins are not tailored. Others read it as a literal bed decorated with iron, a display of royal wealth. Nor is the cubit a fixed modern unit. The verse tells you Og was memorable. It does not tell you his height. Skeptics, meanwhile, should stop saying Genesis simply borrowed Greek myth. The direction of dependence runs the wrong way for that. The Hebrew passage is older than the Greek translation that imported the word gigantes, and the Mesopotamian traditions of semi-divine heroes are older still. Whatever is happening here, it is not Homer leaking backwards into Moses, and on the most famous giant of all, honesty requires an uncomfortable admission. Everyone knows Goliath stood 6 cubits and a span, somewhere close to 9 feet 9 inches. So reads the traditional Hebrew text, except that the Greek translation, the manuscript of Samuel recovered from the 4th cave at Qumran, and Josephus all give a different number, 4 cubits and a span, around 6 feet 9. Many scholars consider the shorter reading the older one, partly because the Qumran manuscript predates our oldest complete Hebrew manuscript by roughly 1,000 years, and partly because scribes tend to inflate legends rather than shrink them. Several modern Bibles now carry a footnote saying exactly this. Others defend the traditional figure, and the question is not closed. I mention it because it tells you something honest about how giants work in human memory. They grow. Every generation adds a cubit, which is worth remembering When you are deciding how literally to read a word, 10 frightened men shouted at a crowd. So what was actually happening in Genesis 6? Let me give you the image I keep coming back to. Picture the hull of a great ship. What keeps it afloat is not the outer plating alone. What keeps it afloat is the bulkheads, the internal walls dividing the hull into sealed compartments. Breach the plating, and one compartment floods, and the ship rides lower and keeps going. The water is contained because the walls hold. Now knock out a bulkhead. Now the compartments are one compartment. Now the water that entered at one point runs the whole length of the vessel, and the ship does not slowly settle. It goes down by the head all at once because the architecture that made a hole survivable has been removed. Genesis 1 is a chapter about bulkheads. Read it again and count the separations. Light divided from darkness. Waters above divided from waters below by an expanse. Sea divided from dry land. Living things made according to their kinds. The creation account is not primarily about manufacture. The subject is partition. God makes a habitable world by installing walls. Genesis 6 is a bulkhead coming out. Beings from one compartment cross into another. And whatever else that story is, it is a breach in the architecture. And look at how the flood arrives. Not as weather. Genesis 7 verse 11 says the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the windows of heaven were opened. The waters below and the waters above, the two things separated on the second day of creation, come back together. Scholars have a name for this pattern. They call it decreation. What Genesis describes is not a punishment bolted onto the story from outside. The world is running backwards, chaos returning through a gap that should not exist. The building did not collapse because someone was angry at it. It collapsed because a load-bearing wall was removed. Whether you read the sons of God as angels, as tyrant kings, or as the compromised line of Seth, the shape of the story is identical in all three. A boundary God installed was crossed by beings who wanted something on the other side of it, and the water came in. Which is why the question refuses to die. Stand back far enough and look at the whole thing. 2,500 years of argument. Jewish writers at Qumran filling scrolls with the giants' nightmares. Josephus explaining to Romans that their Titan stories were a garbled memory of something real. Justin and Irenaeus and Tertullian building demonology on it. Africanus quietly proposing an alternative. Chrysostom preaching against the old reading. Augustine closing the case. 1,000 years of medieval silence. And in 1947 the caves open and the Aramaic fragments come out of the dark, and the whole argument starts again. And underneath all of it, the same question wearing different clothes in every century. Can the wall be crossed? Because that is what actually frightens people about this passage. Not the height of anybody. What unsettles us is the suggestion that the barrier between the seen and the unseen is not sealed. That something could come through. That the world has a door in it, and the door has been used, and it was not used well. The fight about the Nephilim has never really been a fight about giants. It has been a fight about whether the wall between heaven and earth can be crossed. And every generation has answered that question according to what it could afford to believe. But here is the turn, and it is the reason this passage sits where it does in the book. The Bible's answer to that question is not no. The Bible's answer is that the wall has been crossed, in the only direction that ever saved anybody. Genesis 6 shows you a crossing from above that takes. Beings who leave their assigned place seize what they want. Father a generation of men who make a name for themselves, and leave a drowned world behind them. John's Gospel shows you the other crossing. The Word became flesh and lived among us. Not a raid, not a seizure. A descent that gave, that emptied itself, that took a name rather than made one, and that went down not into a flood, but into a grave, and came back up. Same wall, same direction of travel, heaven to earth. Opposite motive, opposite result. The men of the name are gone. Nobody can tell you a single one of their names. Not one survives, in Hebrew or Greek or anywhere else. All that vanity, all that renown, all that terror, and the text that mentions them will not even grant them a syllable to be remembered by. The man who refused to grasp at glory has the name that every knee bends to. This is what those 4 impossible verses are guarding. No secret about hybrids. A warning about which way you want the traffic to move between heaven and earth, and what it costs when something comes down to take instead of to give. So do one thing this week. Open whatever Bible you have to, Numbers 13 verse 33, and look at what your translation actually printed there. Giants, or Nephilim, Then read the footnote underneath, and notice how carefully it hedges. Then come back and tell me which word your Bible chose and what its note admitted, because I want to know how many of us have been reading a translator's decision and calling it the text. And if that thread interests you, the Book of Enoch is sitting right underneath this whole conversation, quoted by Jude, buried at Qumran, and treated as scripture by exactly one church on earth today. That story deserves its own hour, and it may get one.